Centuries ago, Auntie Tourmaline and Uncle Salt led their folk out from slavery to the humans and into the waste, where neither Ursy nor human dwelt. They called them Auntie and Uncle out of affection, for they were great leaders. The humans pursued them, of course, hunting the dwarves as they fled through those low dune-like ridges of multi-hued sands. The landscape undulated with color, as if painted by a feather in variegated strokes. Neither the dwarves nor the pursuing men fared well in that inhospitable place where the sun bore down like hot lead and the ground burned their feet. Then the dwarves found Deep Cut, a dry canyon opening in the waste. With the humans on their heels, they fled down over rough sandstone and shale. There they found fissures into the deeps where the humans dared not follow. Down they climbed through passages of sandstone until they came at last to the vast underground lakes, as if all the moisture of the world had sunk down away from the sun, carving its way through the sandstone until it came to rest on a bed of granite in aquifer lakes. On those deep, cool shores the dwarves rested, given sight by the miner's eye that grew of its own there, tracing up the cavern walls with its blue-green light. As if by a miracle, the lakes were full of the eyeless fish of the dark, and they ate and rested beneath the desert waste. Their folk had found salvation beneath a land no one else wanted. But water and fish were not all they found. Though few precious metals were to be had near Deep Cut, huge swaths of anthracite coal lay buried there, and beds of salt hundreds of feet deep. After digging a shaft through the granite, they found something else, an oil of the earth, bottled up as if under pressure, spraying out from beneath the rock, black and rich. Alas, for those who first found out that it could burn. With those gifts of the deep, the dwarves had harnessed steam, and so cultivated the land again in the folds and terraces of the canyon, pumping water to irrigate. In Deep Cut, their folk thrived and replenished their numbers over the centuries, where Auntie Tourmaline and Uncle Salt closed their eyes and lay entombed, and on this day, the day they reached the underground lake and ate their fill of fish, they celebrated their exodus year after year. They celebrated with fried fish and pipe smoke and beer, ale, mead, or whatever liquor was at hand. Except for Hobblefoot's last hill smoke, their group of prospectors had only one of those elements: fish. Jorvig and the others gave up work for the day and headed out to the river, first to net from the weir, and then to use hooks and lines and worms to see what they could catch as the morning wore on. Perhaps the memory of their folk smiled on them, for by the time the sun glared down from on high with its garish light, they had enough fish to each feast their fill, including an eel that had found its way into the weir. The dwarves had set a wide, flat piece of sandstone outside the adit and used it as a base for their cook fire, but they ate inside the adit to stay out of the sun, leaning against the rough stone walls, facing each other in two lines, their legs crossed beneath them. They ate from carved wooden trenchers, picking the flesh off the bone with their fingers and sucking the juice from ring slices of the eel. They used some of Jorvig's salt, for they had no other seasoning and nothing but spring water to drink. The night before, Warmcoat had soaked needles of white pine in a bucket of water to give it a little tang, a little extra flavor. They closed their eyes and pretended that they drank ale, the froth flecking their beards as the sound of the stone flutes and bronze-stringed harps undergirded the songs of their folk in a home far away and full of their kin. "What are we going to name our claim?" Saviarm asked as he sucked the juice off of his thumb and then his forefinger. Name it? Sledgefist asked. Shouldn't we strike first? Shineboot asked. Should we? Saviarm asked back. Well, aren't claims and mines often named after what they produce? Like Ironhold and Bronze Pass? We don't call Deep Cut the Salt Cut, Saviarm said. No. And then there's Spindle's Gulch. All right. Quartz Dell, Warmcoat said. The others looked over at him. Where's Quartz Dell? Hobblefoot asked. Here, we should call it Quartz Dell. The dwarves looked around at each other. Shineboot shrugged. Quartz Dell, Saviarm said quietly. There is an awful lot of quartz. Once we strike, Shineboot said, will we go back to Deep Cut, do you think? I mean, once we've enough. I hear that East Spire is nearly grown to a colony now, Hobblefoot answered. Deep Cut is mined out, but for coal and salt. It's home, though, Shineboot said. But the air is often foul, Sledgefist said. It was true. The smoke of the coal fires and burning oil could be seen for tens of miles across the waste, rising from vents and shafts cut for circulation. Let the tillers and the tinkers have it. I like these mountains. It's good stone, and there's good air here. It's no Kara Indul, but it's good rock and good air. It's no Kara Indul, the others muttered under their breath. I supposed it matters where the maids are, Hobblefoot said. Aye, yes, Sledgefist answered. It matters that. We could stay here, Warmcoat said, lending a few more of his few words. What, and start a colony? Hobblefoot squinted at the dwarf. Warmcoat shrugged. I don't know about a colony, Saviarm cut in, but Sledgefist is right. The air is good here, above and below the rock. They did not mine for the rest of that day. It was tradition not to mine on the day of deliverance. Even so, dwarves do not sit still and rest easily, and lacking intoxicating drink or enough food to eat themselves to bursting for hours on end, the dwarves took to mending and honing and sharpening. Even for Jorvig, who had only just arrived, clothes needed needle and thread, tool blades needed attention, boots needed cleaned and oiled. If they did not strike in another year, they would have to return to Deep Cut empty-handed, if only to resupply. But they had pooled their wages for a whole year, just to afford the supplies they already had. If this claim didn't pay, it would be years before they could realistically look for another. They all knew it. How could they not? Yet no one would breathe the possibility, not at least until they'd endured a long winter to come. Until then they would hope that they found enough food to give themselves enough strength to mine, to find something of worth, something that they could take back to Deep Cut. They worked with their hands in companionable silence, leaning against the sides of the drift, letting only the comforting sound of whetstone or stropping leather reach their ears. No doubt they all had their own thoughts about what was to come. Jorvig was thinking of the seam high in the rock face only a few hundred yards away. The next day, Jorvig stepped out of the storeroom at the same moment that Sledgefist rolled out of his sleeping alcove. He looked up. Jorvig couldn't make out his brother's face, as it was still dark outside, and only a small amount of light made it this far into the adit. "You are still sleeping in there?" Sledgefist asked. It was an unnecessary question. Sledgefist already knew the answer. "I haven't dug an alcove yet." "Where are you digging out there?" "On the north rock face." Sledgefist nodded as he twisted the thick rawhide laces around his boots. "Do the others mind?" Jorvig asked. His brother shrugged. "No one has said anything. I'm sure they'd appreciate your efforts, but of course, if you're busy—" It was a stinging rebuke from his brother. Jorvik grimaced. Though Sledgefist couldn't have seen it, yet his brother must have felt the reaction. "The weir gave us fish for yesterday," he added. The simple fact was as close to a compliment as could be expected. "If I do not strike by the end of this week, I will join below." So be it. Jorvik's time of self-determination was running out. He knew Sledgefist wouldn't be pleased with him taking another week away from the rhythms of the claim, but he couldn't get the upper vein out of his thoughts. He wanted to look into it just a short distance further. The brothers parted, and Jorvik made his way back up the hillside. He'd been planning to dig a rude stepway into the rock face, so he wouldn't have to lower himself from the cliff again. But he wouldn't have time now. He'd use the rope alone, and if he found nothing this week, he'd forget about it if he could. It was not in the nature of dwarves to forget a seam when they still believed it could pay. By the time the sky had paled with the dawn, Jorvik was securing his rope above the rock face, checking it for any sign of fraying or wear. During the day of deliverance, he had woven a thick pad of river grasses to keep the rope from damage where it held the weight against the edge of the rock face. As he stepped carefully backward, he made sure to position the pad as best he could. Then he was over the edge, walking backwards down to the seam. He reached it without incident. 50 feet below, on the slope of the mountain, fresh-cut stakes of wood were set at close intervals in a half-circle from the rock face, each carved with a mine rune, the symbol for falling rock. He'd carved a few more into trees nearby just to be safe. The odds that one of the other dwarves would come up the hillside and not notice him mining above were slim, but such precautions were engraved into him through years of apprenticeship in the mines. Even far in the wilderness, he would have felt uneasy, ignoring the precaution. In his first year as an apprentice in the salt mines, he'd watched a Rinlin slap another apprentice across the face and hurl such speech that even Jorvik's face was red at the end, even though he'd had nothing to do with the offense. It was over a forgotten mine rune. In dwarven society, such a strike to the face could have led to bloodshed, but no one would question it in such a case between a new apprentice and a Rinlin. No one would forget the lesson either. Salt mining used the room and pillar method, or smaller stoppings where the rock was not sufficiently safe. Large halls were dug out of the salt-laden rock, leaving pillars at intervals to support the overburden. That would not be the case here at the claim. They may stop some areas of the sandstone, in other words, dig out a pocket, resulting in a wide-open space in the rock. But the primary work would be in sinking shafts and cutting drifts to follow veins until they paid out. If they hit a big enough pocket, they'd have to consider whether to pillar with stone or use square-set wood bracings for a stope. Wood bracing was sufficient when the intent was to abandon the working when it had paid out, or until permanent stone supports were built by masons. But first things first, the strike of the pick shocked the dell out of early dawn stillness, the familiar sound of steel on quartz. A crow cawed in response. Jorvik struck again and again. He had set himself aggressive goals for the day, beginning with dislodging a solid chunk of quartz with his pick. If it came out of the sandstone hole as he expected, it would give him angles to work more ably with his chisels. Flakes of matrix caught in his beard, and he struck on. How far an experienced dwarf miner could dig in a single shift, dwarves did not reckon it as days, as they only loosely followed the turnings of sun and moon. depended on the tools, the methods, and most importantly, the rock itself. To dig through granite was many times slower than digging through sandstone. Where he may have expected to move 2 cubic yards of material in a 16-hour stretch, he far exceeded it that day. Jorvig was aided by how easily the vein of quartz broke away from the sandstone seams. In addition, the rock simply fell away down the rock face, and even when he'd formed a foothold, he could simply slide the stone off the edge with his foot. There was no need to take turns between pick and shovel. He looked at the stone often enough as he dug, following the flecks of mineralization on the quartz, but he would give the ore below a more careful examination at a later time. The important thing to do was to make a landing in the rock face. And he did. The sun had already set by the time he walked back up the cliff, but he had accomplished his goal and more. The next day, Jorvig did not have to scale the mountainside and trek back down the arm-like ridge above the cliff. He had carved an anchor point at the top of his shallow adit 50 feet above the del's slope, and he had secured the remaining length of his rope there before climbing back up. Thankfully, he had brought a 100-foot coil of rope, one of the best things to bring on a prospecting expedition, and the cliff itself stretched only 110 feet from slope to slope. Thankfully, he had dumped enough of the broken rock over the edge of the rock face that he was able to pile it as a footing for a fallen log and reach the hanging bottom of the rope. The rope was of woven fiber, capable of holding at least 1 ton, but relatively thin and light. Traveling dwarves often wore it wrapped around their torsos, as it served both for protection and an easy method of carrying. It was still the dark of morning as Jorvig worked his way up, chiseling shallow footholds as he went. That would make it easier in future. Given more time, he would have carved a stair, but this would do for now. The sun had just risen by the time he reached the narrow adit in the cliff face. He could have made the adit both narrower and lower, but he needed room to swing pick and hammer. As it was, he could now stand safely within, 50 feet above the slope of the dell. Soon rock fell again, landing in the pile of broken stone beneath the opening. Some of it skipped and rolled down the slope, smashing into tree or boulder with a resounding clatter that echoed through the otherwise quiet dell. Even the crows grew tired of the racket and flew away. The sun had ascended on high, though Jorvig was sheltered in his cut, when a voice called up from the dell below, "Oi, Chargrim!" Jorvig stopped and turned toward the opening. He squinted in the sunlight as he peered over the edge. It was Saviarm, standing well back from the ring of stakes with the cave rune carvings. He had a big grin on his face. "Come on, we've struck," he yelled. "What mineral?" Jorvig called down. "Come see for yourself." He didn't need telling twice. He secured his tools on his pack and harness and grabbed hold of the rope, making a quick descent, the rope sliding through his calloused palms. He barely felt the heat. He landed on the pile of broken rock and ore. Pieces clattered away under his hobnail boots. "Sure did pick an easy spot," Saviarm said, glancing back up at the adit above. "I was just curious." Savvy shrugged, still looking up. Jorvig knew he was marking the confluence of the 2 seams. "We saw that when we surveyed, but—" He trailed off. Then he remembered his errand. "Come on!" They hurried down the slope, circled the tailings pond, rushed down the adit and down the chute ladder, Jorvig first. He heard the excited voices of the other dwarves as he reached the bottom of the shaft. "There's my brother!" Sledgefist shouted. "Oi, look at this!" Sledgefist held up a deep, dark crystal to the smoky light of the rancid oil lamp. At first it looked black, but Jorvig's eyes were quickly adjusting. In only another 2 heartbeats he perceived the color, dark, deep purple. It was a crystal amethyst point as long as Sledgefist's forearm, the base still embedded in matrix that showed flecks of pyrite, and maybe a vein of hematite, too. Jorvig stepped up close, staring into the depths of the crystal. Yes, there was hematite in the matrix. The others had grown quiet, enjoying as Jorvig saw it for the first time. "We struck a wider part of the igneous intrusion last night," Sledgefist explained. "We hit pyrite and hematite, but now—" Sledgefist motioned Jorvig's attention to the drift wall. There was more color there, whole crystal points embedded in matrix. He shook his head, lost for words. Sledgefist slapped his shoulder, sending dust flying. "I told you! I told you!" Jorvig had seen amethyst before and plenty of crystal points, but it was rare to find a pocket of such size and depth of color. Amethysts ranged from pale, with barely any color, to the rare deep hues that he saw before him. The pocket wouldn't likely make them all wealthy, not unless it went far and deep, but these stones were valuable. Lapidarists, setters, jewelers, and purveyors back in Deep Cut would wage war with their bids for such fine specimens. They'd end up as pieces for the rich back in Deep Cut, set in headdresses, circlets, war helms, necklaces, breastpieces. "There's a bit of jasper here, too," Hobblefoot said, pointing at the drift wall, "worth getting out as well." "We'll have to separate it all out," Sledgefist said. "We'll need you now," he added in a lower tone to Jorvig. Jorvig nodded. He was happy. He truly was. He also couldn't help but wonder what could be found where 2 similar seams crossed. It took 2 weeks to reach the end of the pocket of amethyst. Whether it was because of distraction on the part of the foragers, or simply the approach of fall and overhunting the area in and around the dell, they also ate poorly. Warmcoat brought down a wild turkey with a stone from his sling, and that was the best meal they ate in that time, but among 6 dwarves it did not go far. Jorvig sucked marrow out of a bone, all he had for a whole day. The mining distracted them somewhat. They had amassed a collection of fine amethyst crystal points, some clustered in multiples. They would need further cleaning and polishing, but it was astounding what clarity they already possessed. There were varying qualities, but many were of the deep purple color, others smoky. An abundance of smaller, gravel-like amethyst gems also filled a sack next to a pile of hematite ore in the storeroom. But the pocket ended, though the quartz lode split into 2 separate, somewhat smaller veins, and diverted, one following a seam in the sandstone and heading upward and north, while the other filled an ancient igneous vent rising to their level from below. "There will be more," Sledgefist said, as they leaned on their picks and stared at the drift wall. They had expanded the drift into a small stope, twice the height of a dwarf, and a few times as wide. They'd left a couple sandstone pillars on either side for support. "I am weary to the bone," Savyarm said. "I think I haven't slept in a time and half a time." "Nor I," Hobblefoot answered. "Let us take a short rest and then make our plans." The dwarves afforded themselves the luxury of roughly 6 hours of unbroken sleep before they gathered back together with empty stomachs. There was no food to break their fast, though by the light that entered the adit it was late afternoon. The amethyst crystals lay in a triple line along the floor of the storeroom. "Well, now the Hardfells should feel their necks itching," Sledgefist said. "They'll feel right foolish when they don't get the chance to cut them," Hobblefoot said. "What do you mean?" Sledgefist asked, his brows furrowing. "When we sell them to the highest bidder." "We're not going to sell them in the rough." Hobblefoot frowned.